Sorry, it's full. You'll have to make do with economy. The gate agent didn't even look up from her computer screen when she said it. Her voice carried that familiar tone of practiced indifference, the kind that makes you feel invisible before you've even finished asking your question. The old man standing before her counter shifted his weight from one leg to the other, his cane trembling slightly under the pressure. He'd asked politely. Explained about his injuries, his difficulty sitting in cramped spaces for long flights. Mentioned that he had miles, loyalty points, anything that might help. But she'd already made up her mind the moment she saw him shuffling toward her desk in his faded jacket and worn shoes. To her, he looked like just another elderly passenger trying to get something for nothing. Someone who probably complained about everything and expected special treatment because of his age. She had no idea that the man standing before her had once crawled through enemy fire to pull 3 wounded soldiers to safety. Had no idea that the limp she barely noticed came from shrapnel that doctors said should have killed him. All she saw was an inconvenience during her already stressful day. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this journey. The airport was one of those massive hubs where humanity flows like water through endless corridors of steel and glass. Gate 47B sat tucked between a coffee shop that charged $7 for burnt coffee and a newsstand selling magazines nobody reads anymore. The terminal hummed with that constant background noise of rolling luggage, boarding announcements, and conversations in a dozen different languages. Flight 1847 to Dallas was scheduled to depart in 45 minutes, and the boarding area was already packed with the usual mix of business travelers typing furiously on laptops, families juggling crying children and too much carry-on luggage, and solo passengers staring at their phones like they held the secrets of the universe. Near the back of the seating area, an elderly man sat alone with his hands folded over the handle of a wooden cane. His name was Robert Chin, though nobody at the airport knew that. At 73, he moved with the deliberate care of someone whose body had been through things most people couldn't imagine. His left leg, the one that gave him the most trouble, had been rebuilt twice after an IED explosion outside Fallujah in 2004. Robert had been a combat medic then, attached to a unit of Marines barely out of high school who called him Doc, and treated him like a favorite uncle despite the fact that he was probably only 10 years older than most of them. He'd been older than average when he enlisted, joining the Army at 38 after his wife died and his kids moved away for college. Said he needed purpose, needed to feel useful again. The doctors had told him he'd never walk normally again after the blast. They were wrong about that, but they were right about the pain. It never really went away, just moved around like an unwelcome houseguest, settling in his hip on rainy days, his knee when he sat too long, his back when he tried to sleep. The flight to Dallas wasn't for vacation. His grandson was graduating from college, the first in the family to get a degree, and Robert had promised to be there. He'd saved for months to afford the ticket, choosing this particular flight because it was direct and would get him there with enough time to rest before the ceremony. He'd arrived at the airport 3 hours early, partly out of old military habit and partly because walking took him longer now. He checked his bag, made it through security without too much trouble despite the metal detector's confusion over the hardware in his leg, and found his gate with time to spare. That's when he'd seen the business class section during boarding for the previous flight. Wider seats, more legroom, space to stretch out. He'd watched passengers settle into those seats with a mixture of longing and resignation. He knew he couldn't afford to book business class outright, but he also knew airlines sometimes had last-minute upgrades available. So he'd approached the gate agent, a woman in her 30s with perfectly styled hair and a smile that looked painted on. She wore a name tag that read Jennifer and had the demeanor of someone who'd been dealing with difficult passengers all day. Robert had waited patiently in line behind a businessman arguing about his connection time and a mother trying to get seats together for her family. When his turn came, he'd stepped forward carefully, placing his cane against the counter for balance. "Excuse me, miss," he'd said, his voice carrying the soft drawl of someone who'd grown up in small-town Texas. "I was wondering if there might be any upgrades available for this flight. I have some difficulties with my legs, service-related injuries, and the extra space would really help." Jennifer had looked up from her computer screen with the expression of someone who'd heard every sob story in the book. She'd seen the cane, noticed the way he favored his left side, but instead of compassion, she felt irritation. Another passenger trying to game the system, trying to get something for nothing by playing the sympathy card. "Sir, business class is completely full," she'd said, her tone suggesting the conversation was already over. You'll need to take your assigned seat in economy. The flight is boarding in 30 minutes. Robert had nodded, understanding but still hoping. I do have some miles accumulated, and I'd be happy to pay the difference if there's anything available. Even an aisle seat in Economy Plus would help. Jennifer's fingers had clicked across her keyboard with theatrical emphasis, her eyes never leaving the screen. I'm showing everything is sold out. Sorry, but you'll have to make do with what you booked. The words hung in the air like a small cruelty. Make do. As if his decades of service, his sacrifices, his pain, were just minor inconveniences he should quietly accept. As if the shrapnel still embedded in his hip was something he should simply work around for the comfort of others. Robert had thanked her anyway, because that's who he was. He gathered his cane and his small carry-on bag and found a seat in the boarding area, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to manage pain without complaint. Around him, the gate area continued its normal rhythm. Business travelers checked their phones, families organized their belongings, teenagers slouched in chairs with earbuds blocking out the world. Nobody paid attention to the elderly man with the cane. Nobody wondered about his story or considered that his quiet dignity might be covering something extraordinary. The boarding announcement crackled over the intercom 30 minutes later. First class and business class passengers were invited to board first, followed by premium members, families with small children, and passengers needing assistance. Robert watched as the privileged few walked down the jet bridge with their expensive luggage and casual confidence. When his boarding group was called, he stood slowly, gathered his things, and joined the line of economy passengers shuffling toward the gate. His carry-on bag wasn't heavy, but every step sent small jolts of discomfort through his rebuilt leg. He'd learned to hide it well over the years, but airports were particularly challenging with all the walking and standing and sitting in uncomfortable positions. The flight attendant at the gate checked his boarding pass with a professional smile and wished him a pleasant flight. She didn't notice his limp or the way he gripped his cane a little tighter as he walked down the jet bridge. To her, he was just another passenger, another face in the endless stream of people passing through her workday. The aircraft was a Boeing 737, narrow-bodied with 3 seats on each side of a single aisle. Robert's seat was in row 23, a middle seat squeezed between a college student already asleep against the window and a businessman who'd claimed both armrests before Robert even arrived. Getting to his row required navigating past flight attendants preparing the cabin, passengers struggling with overhead bins, and the general chaos of people trying to settle into spaces that seemed designed for smaller humans from a different era. Each step was a small challenge, each pause to let someone pass a test of his patience and pain tolerance. When he finally reached row 23, Robert stood in the aisle for a moment, looking at the narrow space he'd be occupying for the next 3 hours. The middle seat was exactly as cramped as he'd feared, with barely enough room for his legs and no place to position his cane except in the small space between his feet. The businessman in the aisle seat looked up from his phone with annoyance, as if Robert's presence was an interruption to his important work. He moved his legs slightly to let Robert pass, but not far enough to make it easy. The gesture was calculated, designed to suggest that Robert was the one being inconvenient. Robert squeezed into his seat with as much grace as he could manage, though the process required him to bend and twist in ways that his rebuilt hip didn't appreciate. He settled his cane between his legs, buckled his seatbelt, and tried to find a position that didn't aggravate his injuries. The college student by the window woke up briefly as Robert sat down, glanced at him with the casual indifference of youth, and promptly fell back asleep. The businessman returned to his phone without acknowledgement, spreading his papers across the tray table and into Robert's space. As the plane filled up around him, Robert closed his eyes and tried to focus on the reason for his trip. His grandson's graduation, the pride in the young man's voice when he'd called to invite him, the way his daughter had cried when she'd heard Robert was coming. These were the things that mattered, the reasons he endured the discomfort and expense of travel at his age. But sitting in that cramped seat, surrounded by strangers who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to their own comfort, Robert couldn't help but feel a familiar sense of invisibility. It was the same feeling he'd experienced in VA hospitals, in government offices, in the 100 small interactions where his service seemed to count for nothing. He'd never been one to demand special treatment or wave his military record around like a flag. His generation had been taught that service was its own reward, that heroes didn't need parades or public recognition. But sometimes, in moments like this, he wondered if the world had simply forgotten that people like him existed. The flight attendants made their safety announcements, demonstrated the proper use of seat belts and oxygen masks, and prepared for takeoff. Robert listened politely, though he'd heard it all countless times before. He knew about emergency procedures, about staying calm under pressure, about helping others when systems failed. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi to the runway, Robert shifted in his seat, trying to find a position that didn't send shooting pains through his hip. The businessman beside him glanced over with irritation, as if Robert's discomfort was somehow disrupting his work. The college student by the window remained asleep, oblivious to everything except whatever dreams occupied his young mind. Around them, the cabin filled with the usual sounds of a flight preparing for departure: nervous laughter, crying babies, the rustle of magazines, and the click of seatbelts. Robert closed his eyes and tried to transport himself somewhere else, anywhere but this narrow metal tube where he felt more invisible than ever. He thought about his grandson, about the pride in the young man's voice, about the moment when he'd walk across that stage and receive his diploma. He thought about his late wife, about how proud she would have been to see their grandson succeed. She'd always believed in education, always pushed their children to do better than their parents had. She would have found a way to make this trip easier, would have known exactly what to say to that gate agent to secure an upgrade. But she was gone now, had been gone for 15 years, and Robert was on his own in a world that seemed increasingly designed for people unlike him. People who didn't carry the weight of old injuries, old memories, old wars that most Americans had already forgotten. The plane reached the runway and paused, waiting for clearance from the tower. In that moment of stillness, Robert opened his eyes and looked around the cabin one more time. Passengers were settling in for the flight, adjusting pillows, opening books, checking phones one last time before takeoff. Nobody was looking at him. Nobody was wondering about his story or considering that the quiet man in the middle seat might have once risked his life for strangers. To them, he was just another passenger, just another face in the crowd, just another minor inconvenience in their own personal journeys. The engine spooled up, and the plane began its acceleration down the runway. Robert gripped his cane and braced himself for takeoff, knowing that the next 3 hours would test his endurance in ways that most people his age never had to consider. But he also knew he'd survive it, because he'd survived worse. Much worse. 20 minutes into the flight, as the plane reached its cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign finally turned off, passengers began the familiar ritual of getting comfortable for the journey ahead. Some pulled out laptops, others reclined their seats, and a few brave souls ventured to the lavatories despite the flight attendant's warnings about turbulence. In the cockpit, Captain Miguel Rodriguez was reviewing the flight plan with his first officer when something caught his attention. It was a passenger manifest notation that he almost missed, the kind of small detail that usually doesn't require the captain's attention but sometimes tells a story worth knowing. Rodriguez had been flying commercial aircraft for 12 years, but before that, he'd spent 8 years as a helicopter pilot in the Army, including 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He'd left the military as a major, transitioning to civilian aviation with the disciplined precision that military pilots brought to commercial flying. He was 41 now, married with 2 young daughters, living the kind of stable suburban life he'd dreamed about during those long deployments overseas. But he'd never forgotten where he came from, never forgotten the men and women who'd served alongside him, and never forgotten the debt he owed to those who'd kept him alive when the world was trying to kill him. The notation on the passenger manifest was simple: Robert Chin, military veteran, special assistance requested. It was the kind of note that gate agents sometimes added when passengers mentioned service-related needs, though it rarely meant anything to the flight crew. But something about the name struck Rodriguez as familiar. Robert Chin. He'd heard that name before, somewhere in his military past. As the first officer handled the routine communications with air traffic control, Rodriguez found himself searching his memory, trying to place where he'd encountered that name. It came to him slowly, like a photograph developing in his mind. Forward Operating Base Liberty, outside Baghdad, 2005. Rodriguez had been a young warrant officer then, flying medevac missions in a UH-60 Black Hawk. One particular mission stood out: an emergency extraction that had gone wrong in every possible way. His helicopter had been shot down while attempting to evacuate wounded soldiers from a firefight that had gone sideways. The aircraft had auto-rotated into a controlled crash landing in hostile territory, leaving Rodriguez and his crew stranded with multiple casualties and no immediate backup. That's when the medic had appeared. An older soldier, probably in his 40s, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who'd seen everything war could throw at him. He'd organized the casualties, treated the wounded, and somehow kept everyone alive during the 6 hours it took for rescue to arrive. Rodriguez remembered the man's voice, steady and reassuring even as enemy fire peppered their position. He remembered watching him work on a young private who'd been gutshot, his hands never shaking even as bullets whined overhead. He remembered the way the man had rationed their water, distributed their ammunition, and made command decisions without ever pulling rank or raising his voice. Most of all, he remembered the man's name tag, Chin. Rodriguez felt his pulse quicken as the memory crystallized. Doc Chin, the combat medic who'd saved his life and the lives of his crew. The man who'd refused a medal recommendation, who'd gone back to his unit the next day like nothing had happened, who'd treated heroism like just another part of the job. Without hesitation, Rodriguez unbuckled his harness and stood up. His first officer looked at him with curiosity, but Rodriguez just smiled and said, "I need to check on something in the cabin. You have the aircraft." It was unusual for a captain to leave the cockpit during cruise flight, but not unheard of. Sometimes pilots needed to address passenger concerns, inspect mechanical issues, or simply stretch their legs on long flights. The first officer nodded and took control while Rodriguez made his way to the cabin door. The moment Rodriguez stepped into the passenger cabin, he began scanning the seats, looking for the face that matched his memory. The business class section was full of the usual suspects, executives in expensive suits, frequent flyers who'd earned their upgrades through loyalty programs, and a few passengers who'd simply paid for the privilege of extra space. Rodriguez continued toward the back of the plane, his eyes methodically checking each row. He was looking for an elderly man, probably in his 70s now, someone who might be traveling alone and might need the kind of assistance that gate agents rarely provided. He found him in row 23, squeezed into a middle seat between two passengers who seemed oblivious to his discomfort. The man was older than Rodriguez remembered, grayer and more fragile-looking, but the face was unmistakable. The same calm eyes, the same quiet dignity, the same aura of someone who'd seen too much but carried it without complaint. Rodriguez felt a wave of emotion that surprised him with its intensity. Here was the man who'd saved his life, sitting in one of the worst seats on the airplane, treated like just another inconvenience by a system that had forgotten what he'd done. For a moment, Rodriguez just stood in the aisle, watching Robert Chin try to find a comfortable position in a seat that was clearly too small for someone with his injuries. The old medic was awake but staring straight ahead, probably trying to manage pain that most people couldn't imagine. The businessman in the aisle seat was typing on his laptop, completely absorbed in whatever deal he was working on. The college student by the window was still asleep, earbuds in, unconscious to the world around him. Neither of them had any idea that they were sitting next to someone who'd risked his life for strangers, someone who'd earned a place of honor that he'd never claimed. Rodriguez approached the row slowly, his mind racing with the best way to handle what he was about to do. He stopped directly beside Robert's seat and waited for the older man to notice him. When Robert looked up, Rodriguez saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, though it was mixed with confusion. After all, what were the odds that a combat medic from Iraq would encounter a helicopter pilot from the same war on a random commercial flight? "Sir," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the authority of a captain but the warmth of an old friend, "you're in my seat." Robert looked confused, glancing at his boarding pass and then back at the captain's uniform. "No, sir, this is economy. Seat 23B. I'm sure this is where I'm supposed to be." Rodriguez smiled, and suddenly he was 28 years old again, looking up at the medic who just saved his life in the desert outside Baghdad. "Not anymore. Document. I'm Captain Rodriguez, and you saved my unit in Iraq. Business class is too small for what you deserve, but it's a start." The recognition hit Robert like a physical force. The young warrant officer from the helicopter crash, the pilot who'd been so worried about his crew, the kid who'd thanked him over and over during those long hours waiting for rescue. Here he was, 20 years later, wearing captain's stripes and offering something that Robert had never expected. "Miguel." Robert's voice was barely a whisper. "Little Miguel Rodriguez?" Rodriguez laughed, and for a moment the years fell away. "Not so little anymore, document. But I never forgot what you did for us that day. Never forgot how you kept us alive when everything went to hell." The businessman in the aisle seat looked up from his laptop with annoyance, clearly irritated by the interruption to his work. The college student by the window stirred, but didn't wake up. Other passengers began to notice the captain standing in the aisle, talking to the elderly man in the middle seat. Rodriguez reached out his hand to help Robert stand. "Come on, document. Let me show you to your real seat." Robert took the offered hand and rose slowly from his cramped position, his legs protesting after sitting in the narrow space for nearly an hour. As he stood, other passengers began to take notice of what was happening. A few pulled out their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something unusual. Rodriguez didn't care about the attention. He carefully helped Robert gather his belongings, retrieved his cane from between the seats, and began escorting him toward the front of the aircraft. As they walked up the aisle, Rodriguez spoke quietly, his voice carrying just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You know, Doc, I've been flying for 12 years now, and I've never once forgotten that day outside Baghdad. You saved my life and the lives of my crew, and you did it like it was just another day at the office. You never asked for anything, never expected recognition, never even wanted a medal." They passed through the Economy Plus section, where passengers in slightly more comfortable seats watched with curiosity. Some recognized the captain's uniform and wondered why he was personally escorting a passenger. Others noticed Robert's limp, his cane, his quiet dignity, and began to understand that they were witnessing something special. "I heard about this flight," Rodriguez continued, his voice growing stronger as they approached business class. "Heard that you were traveling to see your grandson graduate. Heard that you'd been denied an upgrade despite your service, despite your injuries, despite everything you've done for this country." They entered the business class cabin, where passengers in leather seats looked up from their drinks and tablets with the mild curiosity of people accustomed to privilege. Rodriguez guided Robert to seat 3A, a window seat in the first row with maximum legroom and space to stretch out. "This is your seat," document. "It should have been your seat from the beginning." As Robert settled into the wide leather seat, Rodriguez made sure he was comfortable, helped him position his cane, and adjusted the seat controls to give him the best possible position for his injured leg. Other passengers watched in silence, sensing that they were witnessing something profound but not fully understanding its significance. Rodriguez stood back and looked at Robert, now comfortable in a seat worthy of his service and sacrifice. The old medic's eyes were bright with unshed tears, though his expression remained composed. He was clearly moved by the gesture, but also overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "Captain Rodriguez," Robert said quietly, "you didn't have to do this. I was fine where I was." Rodriguez shook his head with a smile. "No, Doc, you weren't fine. And you shouldn't have to be fine with being treated like you don't matter. You matter more than anyone on this aircraft, including me." He turned to address the business class cabin, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded troops in combat and now commanded aircraft in the sky. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Robert Chin. 20 years ago, this man saved my life and the lives of my crew in Iraq. He's a combat medic, a hero, and the kind of man who makes the freedoms we enjoy possible." The business class cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Passengers stood up, some wiping away tears, others raising their glasses in tribute. A few approached Robert to shake his hand and thank him for his service. The transformation was immediate and complete, from invisible old man to honored hero in the span of a few minutes. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. He walked to the front of the business class cabin and picked up the intercom handset, connecting to the entire aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to take a moment to introduce you to someone special. We have a hero traveling with us today, Robert Chin, a combat medic who served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. 20 years ago, this man saved my life and the lives of my crew when our helicopter was shot down in hostile territory." The entire aircraft fell silent, passengers in economy craning their necks to see what was happening in business class. Mr. Chin never asked for recognition, never sought special treatment, and never complained when he was denied the respect he deserved. But I remember what he did, and I want all of you to remember it too. This is what a real hero looks like: quiet, humble, and still putting others before himself even after all these years. The captain's voice carried through the cabin with the weight of absolute sincerity. "Mr. Chin, from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of everyone on this aircraft, thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. And thank you for showing us what true heroism looks like." The applause that followed could be heard throughout the aircraft. Passengers in economy stood up as much as their cramped quarters allowed, clapping and cheering for a man they'd never noticed before but would never forget. Flight attendants wiped away tears, and even the businessman who'd been so rude earlier stood up and applauded. Robert sat in his business class seat, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of recognition and gratitude. For decades, he'd carried his service quietly, never asking for special treatment, never demanding the respect he'd earned. But in this moment, surrounded by strangers who suddenly understood his worth, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: truly valued. Rodriguez returned to Robert's seat and knelt down beside him, speaking quietly so only the old medic could hear. "Doc, I've got 2 daughters now. They're 8 and 10, and I tell them stories about heroes all the time. Now I get to tell them about the day I met you again, about how you're still teaching people what dignity looks like." Robert reached out and gripped the captain's hand, his voice thick with emotion. "Miguel, you've given me something I didn't know I needed. Thank you." Rodriguez squeezed back and stood up. "No, document. Thank you. For everything." As the captain made his way back to the cockpit, Robert settled into his comfortable seat and looked out the window at the clouds passing below. For the first time in years, he felt like the world had remembered who he was, what he'd done, and why it mattered. The flight continued peacefully, but something had changed in the cabin. Passengers who'd been absorbed in their own worlds suddenly seemed more aware of the people around them. The businessman from economy came forward to apologize for his rudeness and to thank Robert personally. The college student woke up and asked a flight attendant what had happened, then spent the rest of the flight writing in a notebook about the importance of recognizing real heroes. Flight attendants made sure Robert had everything he needed, bringing him extra pillows, offering him premium drinks, and checking on him regularly. Other passengers stopped by to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Some shared their own military stories, others talked about family members who'd served. But Robert remained humble throughout it all, gracious in accepting the thanks but never seeking more attention than he'd already received. He answered questions about his service when asked, but he didn't volunteer details about his wounds or his sacrifices. He was the same quiet, dignified man he'd always been, just finally receiving the recognition he'd always deserved. As the plane began its descent into Dallas, Robert looked around the business-class cabin with wonder. A few hours earlier, he'd been invisible, just another inconvenience in a system that had forgotten his worth. Now he was surrounded by people who understood that some debts can never be fully repaid, only acknowledged with gratitude and respect. The landing was smooth, and as passengers began to disembark, many stopped to say goodbye to Robert and to thank him one more time. Some exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch. Others simply shook his hand and walked away with a new understanding of what true heroism looked like. Captain Rodriguez appeared in the cabin as the last passengers were leaving. He helped Robert gather his belongings and escorted him personally to the gate, where his family was waiting. Robert's daughter burst into tears when she saw him, not because of his upgrade or the attention he'd received, but because she could see something different in his eyes, a spark of recognition, a sense of being valued that had been missing for too long. His grandson, the college graduate who'd invited him to the ceremony, listened with amazement as other passengers told him about what had happened on the flight. The young man had always known his grandfather was special, but seeing him through the eyes of strangers helped him understand just how extraordinary the quiet old man really was. As the family walked through the terminal together, Robert moved with less pain than he'd felt in years. It wasn't because his injuries had healed, they never would completely. It was because he was no longer carrying the weight of invisibility, the burden of being forgotten and overlooked. Captain Rodriguez watched them go, then returned to his aircraft to prepare for the next flight. But he knew that what had happened that day would stay with him forever, just as the memory of Robert Chin's heroism had stayed with him for 20 years. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen in the most ordinary places. Sometimes a hero doesn't need a parade or a medal ceremony. Sometimes all he needs is for one person to remember, to speak up, to ensure that his sacrifice isn't forgotten by a world that moves too fast to notice the quiet dignity of those who've given everything. Robert Chin never asked to be upgraded to business class. He never demanded special treatment or pulled rank based on his service record. He was content to suffer in silence, to endure discomfort without complaint, to remain invisible in a world that had seemingly forgotten his worth. But sometimes, just sometimes, the universe conspires to remind us that every person has a story worth knowing, that every quiet hero deserves recognition, and that the most powerful gestures are often the simplest ones, a hand extended in friendship, a seat offered in respect, a moment of acknowledgement that says, "I see you, I remember you, and I honor what you've done." Captain Rodriguez didn't upgrade Robert Chin because he had to. He did it because he remembered what it felt like to be saved by someone who asked for nothing in return. He did it because he understood that some debts transcend time and circumstance. He did it because he knew that true leadership means recognizing and honoring the sacrifice of others. And in that airplane, 30,000 feet above the American landscape, a room full of strangers learned something profound about heroism, that it often wears civilian clothes, walks with a limp, and sits quietly in middle seats waiting for someone to remember that extraordinary people live ordinary lives all around us. Robert Chen arrived in Dallas to watch his grandson graduate, but he brought with him something more valuable than any diploma, the knowledge that his service mattered, that his sacrifice was remembered, and that heroes don't always need capes or fanfare. Sometimes they just need someone to offer them a better seat and the recognition they've always deserved. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Maybe it was a teacher who changed your life, a parent who sacrificed everything for your future, or a neighbor who helped your family through difficult times. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're here to remind the world that extraordinary people are all around us, living quiet lives of service and sacrifice, waiting for someone to notice their worth. We'll see you in the next one.